Okay, hello. Here we are at week 5 of our distance learning. We have been talking about the 3 branches of government. If you think about since we went on distance learning, we really focused our time on the House of Representatives, on the Senate, on the President, and now we're going to talk about the Supreme Court. So Article 1 of the Constitution talks about Congress, so the House and the Senate. Article 2 of the Constitution talks about the President of the United States. And Article 3 of the Constitution discusses the SCOTUS. SCOTUS is Supreme Court of the United States, SCOTUS. So you'll hear me say SCOTUS. POTUS is President of the United States. You may hear me say that too, so just know that. All right, so let's talk about the background. You know, we talked about that to become a member of the House, you had to be 25 years old. A member of the Senate, you had to be 30 years old. A member to become president, you have to be 35 years old. So for the Supreme Court, you have to be, and there's no requirement at all. Anyone, I can be picked, you can be picked. There are no requirements to be on the Supreme Court. Now, I will tell you that the 9 people that we have on the Supreme Court today are 9 of the most intelligent people on the planet. In order to become a member of the Supreme Court, you have to be appointed by the president. You have to be approved by the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, and then the whole Senate. And that process of the appointment by the president and going through the Senate, although there are no constitutional requirements, I'm never going to be on the Supreme Court. I don't have enough of a legal background to justify for me to be there, so it's not going to happen. I will tell you that if you're on the Supreme Court, you make just over $250,000 a year. If you're Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, you get paid a little bit more than that. Now, how does the Supreme Court work? Well, you're going to hear a term called jurisdiction. Jurisdiction means the right of a court to hear a case. It has jurisdiction over that particular case. We have 2 types of jurisdiction, original and appellate. Original jurisdiction means the case originates there. Like if you're driving, you get a speeding ticket, you would go to traffic court. Appellate jurisdiction means a case has come from a lower court, has been appealed up to a higher court because something happened in the lower court that attorneys felt didn't meet the requirements of the law. It wasn't because of a witness or anything like that. It's something in law had to be broken. So the Supreme Court has both original and appellate jurisdiction, but mostly appellate jurisdiction. If you want to get your case heard in the Supreme Court, you have to fill out like an application. The application is called a writ of certiorari. It's Latin. There's about 7,000 to 8,000 of those sent to the Supreme Court every year. Of that, maybe 70 to 80 of them are accepted. The way for your case to be accepted is you appeal to the court, the justices will read it. There's 9 of them. If 4 of the 9 say, yeah, we want to hear that case, then that case will be heard. It's called the Rule of 4. Very original name, I know. So the Rule of 4 is applied, and then the case gets heard by the Supreme Court. It gets put on a calendar. Once you come up to the calendar, you go to something called oral arguments, where each side has an opportunity to present its side of the case. There is a process. Everybody's got fancy names, like respondent, petitioner, stuff like that. The reality is, if you're an attorney and you start speaking, you won't get out the first sentence before a justice will ask you questions. They've already read all the circumstances of the case. They read your application. They're very familiar with the case. What they want to know is specifics, your specific interpretation of something to determine whether or not they will make a decision one way or another. So that's what oral arguments are about. Once it gets done with oral arguments, it will go to a conference committee, which basically is around a table. They sit and talk about it. Everyone gives their first opinion of what they think. The Chief Justice then will send the case to one of the 9 justices who will write up what's called an opinion. That opinion then will be sent to the other justices, that the justices can agree or disagree, and then they can either write their own opinion of it, or they can write an opinion that dissents, that goes against what the majority of the people feel, or they can just go, I vote this way, and that's it. So, and then once the opinion is done, it's read out in the Supreme Court, and copies of the decision are given to the press. So there is a process. Look, they're there from April till officially May, but usually it goes into June. This year with everything with COVID-19, I'm sure court cases will go into later in the summer. The good percentage of the justices are quite elderly, so it's important for them to be safe. That's the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court set up the Constitution set up the Supreme Court. All the other federal courts get set up later. A lot of them get set up with something called the Federal Judiciary Act of 1789. That was in 1789. That set up a lot of the courts, and then a little bit after that, some other courts were set up. And look, this is just a real simple description of those inferior courts. There's courts below the Supreme Court, but they're not state courts, they're federal courts. There could be district courts, which is basically like the trial courts of the federal government. So if you commit a crime in federal land or you violate federal law, you could have a case heard there. And then there's a court of appeals. And then there's there's all kinds of court of appeals. There's stuff for the military, there's stuff for international law, there's stuff for territories like Puerto Rico or Guam. There's all kinds of courts of appeals. And then the case can even be appealed from that up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So take government, again, in college, and you can get a deeper understanding of those inferior courts. But that gives you an introduction to the process. Look, the main job of the Supreme Court is to look at the acts of state government, federal government, lower courts, to look at the constitutionality of their acts and decide whether they meet the demands of the U.S. Constitution. Supreme Court is considered the highest court of the land. What decision they make, that's the decision, unless the Constitution is amended, and then decisions can then be not changed, but new cases could come up and can be re-argued again. So let's go over a couple things that are considered civil liberties. These are things that are given to us by the amendments to the Constitution, and kind of how the court interprets some of them. And these are some terms that you need to be familiar with. One is called double jeopardy. Double jeopardy, it's part of the Fifth Amendment. It says you cannot be charged for the same crime twice. So like you get charged with the crime, say you get charged with murder, you are found not guilty, new evidence comes out, they can't try to try you for that case because they've already tried you and made a decision. If you go to a court case and the jury can't come to a resolution or agreement on what the decision should be, your case could be retried. That's different because a decision wasn't made. But once a decision is made, you can't be tried again for that particular case. Now, you can be tried in criminal law and then civil law. So if you commit a crime and you're found not guilty, then someone can sue you civilly, which means they're going after money. That's possible. That's allowed. But they can't. If you won't be sent to jail if you're found not guilty of something. That is part of the second term, which we've kind of talked about before, which is due process. Due process is really part of the 14th Amendment, other places as well, but the 14th Amendment. And basically it says that your rights cannot be taken away from you until a specific process has been followed, and that process should be the same for everyone. Rich, poor, black, white, tall, short, male, women, whatever. The process should be the same for all of us. And so that's due process clause, which I told you is part of the 14th Amendment, and we've talked about the 14th Amendment. The next is part of the First Amendment. The First Amendment is your freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, petition. We really want to talk about your freedom of speech. Your freedom of speech is you have the right to pretty much say anything until it potentially can cause harm to another person. That is the time, place, and manner restrictions that are put on you. We've talked about that as well. Time, place, and manner, the time you say something, the place you say something, the way you say something can limit your free speech. And I will tell you, free speech is based on contemporary social values. So if a community says certain language isn't approved, then that speech is not protected. Like, you can't go up to a police officer and just cuss them out. Those words aren't protected speech in that manner. You could have, there are times that speech can be protected, but in that situation of just going up to a police officer and cussing them out, that's not. There is something called defamation. If you say something about somebody or write something about somebody and it causes potential damage to their reputation, you can be sued for what you said or what you wrote. If something is said, that's called slander. If something is written, that's called libel. Typically, that's been in magazines, newspapers, stuff like that. That things are written about someone that may not be true. Their reputation is damaged. The author of what was written can be sued. But you guys need to understand that in this world of social media, you write stuff on Twitter, on Instagram, or you say stuff on Snapchat and Instagram and stuff. And you need to understand that if you damage someone's reputation based on what you put on social media, you can be financially liable to that. That someone can come after you and sue you. So you need to be careful for a multitude of reasons of what you put on social media. There is something called seditious speech, which is speech that is calling for the overthrow of the government. Obviously, that's not allowed. That's not speech that is allowed by your freedom of speech. When when the Declaration of Independence was written, it did talk about a process that you can go through to replace the government that you were under with a new government. It's not overthrowing, it's replacing or fixing. And there is a way to do that today. You can be elected, you can get a law passed in Congress, you can get an amendment to the Constitution. There are things that you can do to change the government of the United States. Seditious speech, talking about the overthrow of the government, is not that way. But you are protected by free speech to say you don't like the government. You can complain about the government. You can complain about people in the government. But you won't get in trouble for that. But if you talk about the overthrow of the government, then you will. So I hope that makes sense. Then there's something called symbolic speech. I know a lot of you will wear clothes. You'll maybe wear something on your wrist, a hat that's got maybe the flag of Venezuela or a flag of Puerto Rico. You're protected. That's called symbolic speech. You have the right to wear that stuff to school or to the mall or to public. You are protected. Symbolic speech is something that's not actually speech, but you're conveying a message, and it's protected by the Constitution. Again, as long as you're not calling for the violent overthrow of the government or causing harm to another person. I gave you guys this example before, but I'll give it to you again. There is a church, I think it's the Westboro Baptist Church. I could be wrong about the name, but I think that's their name as they put it, that protests at funerals of soldiers that come back from Afghanistan and Iraq. And the signs they hold up are unbelievably horrible, but it's protected. That speech is protected. You can protest at a funeral. It's totally allowed to do that in this country. So if you want to know more about them, you can look it up on Google to find out more about who they are. Obviously, we have state courts as well. So think of the entire United States as broken up into different districts. That's the federal courts, and then we have courts within the state. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Florida state courts. We have courts that have original jurisdiction in Florida, like I gave you traffic court, family court, stuff like that. We do have districts within Florida that handle certain cases. It could be murder, could be anything above a certain dollar figure. The cases would go there. We do have an appellate court system in Florida. We do have the Supreme Court of Florida, where the U.S. Supreme Court has 9 justices. The Florida Supreme Court has 7 justices. And so you can be on there and make decisions that impact the state of Florida. One example of something that we have in Florida, I'll tell you that in Florida, if you are found guilty of murder, your case is automatically set to the Florida Supreme Court so that they can look into it and see if you should be put to death. Because, obviously we have the death penalty in Florida. We're one of the states that still does that. So also within the state court system, there's something called Habeas Corpus. So if you get arrested for a crime within a short period of time, typically it's the next day, but it could be a couple days depending on if you're arrested on a Saturday and things like that. We're in court, they have to tell you what charges there are against you, what evidence there is against you, and often at that point they set the bail for what it would be for you to leave jail. So what is bail? Bail is you're going to be held into jail until the time of your trial unless you can supply bail. They give a dollar figure, like $100,000. So you have to pay $100,000 to get out of jail until your case is heard. Now, obviously we don't have $100,000, especially for that. So there are bail bondsmen, and what they do is you come up with 10% of the amount of money that is required for bail. They will supply the rest of that money. It gets you out of jail. You then have to show up to court. When you show up to court, then that money is given back to the bail bondsman, some of which will be given back to you, but they keep a percentage of that because they loaned you a good chunk of money for a period of time. So That's the process of bail and habeas corpus when you're called into court. Obviously, then there's a hearing and a decision, just like I explained with the Supreme Court that court cases here do. Another term you need to be familiar with is something called precedent. Not president. President, like President Trump, but precedent. Precedent is when an action that has happened earlier is taken as an example of something that should be done in the future. And in court cases, that is, if a court made a decision about a case that said it's okay to wear blue shirts, you can't be arrested for later wearing a blue shirt. That would be a precedent was set. Think about in a classroom with a teacher. If a teacher lets you take out your cell phone the first week of school and doesn't correct you, they are setting a precedent that tells you for the rest of the year you're allowed to have your cell phone out. Now, obviously, a teacher may come in and change that, but that's what the term precedent means. For this particular unit, I will tell you it's the most words we have to define. We have 15 words to define, which isn't too ridiculously bad. There is a breakdown of 6 Supreme Court cases for you to look at. I give you a website to go to, and then obviously there's a quiz to take. Please remember that these packets that you do now, I know we've been doing them for a couple weeks this way, so you should know this already, but your packets need to be handwritten. I can't have you guys cutting and pasting. I need you to write it in your handwriting. When you get done, take a picture of it, and then email me the pictures of the pages that you did, and you will continue to get your credit. We are at the end of 5 weeks. At this point, we should be back in school. We'll see. At the time of me filming this, we should be back in school next week. By the time this week comes up, we'll see whether or not we make it. So most importantly, above anything else, stay strong, stay focused, keep washing your hands, keep practicing social distancing, keep focusing on the future, create routines in your life, get up every morning, take a shower, do some schoolwork, maybe go for a walk, go for a jog, ride a bike, walk the dog, all of that stuff. But don't go hang out with your girlfriend, boyfriend, just make good, healthy, smart decisions so we can get through this, so we can all be back in our lives sooner rather than later. As always, if you need any help with anything, shoot me an email.